We're going to be looking at Revelation 13 and 14 today. Not the whole chapters, just actually little bits of each of them and how they relate to one another. Specifically, chapter 13, verse 10. And chapter 14, verse 12. They're both quite similar, but we'll look at what they have in common in their context and how they're different. I take this to be essentially the thrust of the book. Chapter 13:10 says, "Let anyone who has an ear listen. If you were to be taken captive into captivity, you go. If you kill with the sword..." Does somebody have something different there for verse 10?
That's similar.
What does yours say? Mine says, "If you kill with the sword."
If anyone is to be killed with the sword.
I like that better.
With the sword he will be killed.
And then it says, "Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints." We get the same thing in chapter 4:12. "Here is a call for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and hold fast to the faith of Jesus." This is the language we saw in chapter 2 and chapter 3 in the letters. This is the language we see in chapter 1, where John describes himself as someone who partakes with the churches in the endurance of Jesus. Jesus commends some of the churches for the way that they endure. And at the end of the book as well, in chapter 22, I think we see a call for endurance, for remembering that Jesus is coming soon. Chapter 22, verse 12, "See, I'm coming soon, my reward is with me, to repay according to everyone's work." And 14, "Blessed are those who wash their robes, so they will have the right to the tree of life and may enter by the city gates." That's the language we saw in the letters as well. He promised the churches he'd give them to eat of the tree of life if they endure, if they conquer. I was going to not talk about the rapture. Then I was going to talk about it when we talk about the second coming. I've decided to talk about it before we get into this, because depending what you think of the rapture, you might handle this verse differently. If the thrust of the book is a call to endurance for the saints, and the saints aren't around when all the enduring is going on, that might affect how you read it. But before we can even talk about the rapture, look with me at chapter 10. I think this is important. Have chapter 10 in your mind. I'm going to read most of chapter 10 aloud. "And I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven, wrapped in a cloud with a rainbow over his head. His face was like the sun, his legs pillars of fire. He held a little scroll open in his hand. Setting his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land, he gave a great shout, like a lion roaring. And when he shouted, the seven thunders sounded. And when the seven thunders had sounded, I was about to write. But I heard a voice from heaven saying, 'Seal up what the seven thunders have said, and do not write it down.'" It was just that far. Seal up what the seven thunders have said, and do not write it down. I want us to be very careful as we talk about the end times, not to develop a system that is so detailed that we couldn't possibly be wrong about anything. I don't know what these seven thunders said, because John was told not to tell us. So even though this is a book where Jesus says at the beginning, it was given to show his servants what must take place, God is allowed to keep secrets. He didn't tell us in any verse the day that Jesus would come. But it's not given to us to know the times appointed by the Father. Even as we go through the book, I don't think it's extremely clear where Jesus' coming happens in the book. Because it sounds like he comes in chapter 19, but it also sounds like he's already there in chapter 14. It's tricky to figure out. He seems like he's already there in chapter 20, but if it was obvious, we wouldn't all disagree about it. There's things that God has chosen not to reveal. And so we'll talk a bit about the rapture for the first, quarter or half of our time today. But just keep in mind, there's things God hasn't revealed. And so I hope you'll share with me in approaching it humbly. We don't... I'll tell you what I think, but I could be wrong. And some of the people I respect most think I am. So, a lot of the people I respect most think I'm wrong. But, we don't always get time to discuss these things, and if it was clear, we'd all agree. So, let's turn to 1 Thessalonians 4, because this is the passage that talks about the rapture. Just to tell you where I'm going, I'm going to start by giving you the strongest case that I can for why you should believe we could be raptured at any moment. Then I'm going to tell you why I think it's wrong. And then we'll look at the wrath of the beast and the wrath of the Lamb in chapters 13 and 14 in Revelation. Because if the rapture isn't before all the trouble comes, then we want to take to heart what it's saying and be ready to endure. That said, even if the rapture happens any second, you still need to endure until then, including right now. I think we have this wrong idea in our heads. If I was in the end times, I would totally be faithful unto death. Like, I would not deny Jesus for this or that or anything. And then, on a day-to-day basis, we think nothing of this sin or that sin, as though somehow our faith is just going to matter more in the end times, and so we'll muster up more of it. If you don't have faith right now, I don't know where you're going to find it in the end times. So we should seek God. Jesus, when he talks about the end times, he says, "Pray that you may have faith to stand when the Son of Man comes." That's where we'll find faith. So, 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 13. We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters. Mine says and sisters. I didn't bring my Bible, so I've got this one that adds things like sisters, which is fine. Brothers obviously means brothers and sisters. About those who have died, so that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have died. For this we declare to you by a word of the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will by no means precede those who have died. For the Lord himself, with a cry of command, with the archangel's call, and with the sound of God's trumpet, will descend from heaven, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up in the clouds together with them to meet the Lord in the air. So we will be with the Lord forever. Therefore, encourage one another with these words. For those who argue for what we'll call it a pre-trib rapture, that's the terminology that gets thrown around, because it means that we'll all be raptured, caught up in the air to meet Jesus before tribulation comes. Those who argue for that tend to point out similarities and differences between different passages that talk about the coming of the Lord. For example, some passages, like this one, say that we'll be gathered to meet him in the air. Others seem to describe a convergence on Jerusalem. Some passages seem to talk about It's difficult for me to present their case after reading this, because we just read, we who are alive, then, verse 17, we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up in the clouds. And I'm honestly not sure how they read that. It sounds like it's saying that the dead rise, and then there's a rapture. And I wish I had a better idea of where they stood on that verse. I'll present their case as strongly as I can, though. There's two arguments for why you would believe in a pre-tribulational rapture, and they're both quite compelling on their own, I think. One is there's many passages that say that the Lord will come as a thief in the night, that he'll come at very soon. You should be expecting him at an hour you do not expect. And the argument goes that the best way to make sense of that is to believe he could come at any moment. And since we know the Antichrist comes first, The only way you could believe he could come at any moment is if he comes for you, and then the Antichrist comes. Does that make sense? The second argument, and I think even a stronger argument, rests on a lot of presuppositions that I actually agree with from the Old Testament. That God promised Israel he'd restore them to the land. We read this, was it last week we read this from Deuteronomy 30? Yeah. I'll bless you more than I've ever blessed you. Numerically. And Isaiah expands on that quite clearly. In Isaiah 60 through 66, he describes that their numbers will multiply so that people will wonder, has a nation ever been born in a day like this? Where did they all come from? God has made promises to Israel to bless them numerically. In Deuteronomy 1, Moses says, "Today you are as numerous as the sands of the sea. May God multiply you 1,000-fold as he has promised." And so the argument goes, well, when Jesus returns, then those who are alive will be transformed in the twinkling of an eye. If Jesus returns and all the Jews are turned into resurrected Jews, there will be no marriage. And if there's no marriage and no childbearing, how will God fulfill his promises? Therefore, you need a rapture so that Jesus can come and resurrect some of us without resurrecting the Jews. That's a bit of a weird argument, I think. But I do think it's the strongest argument if you're going to argue for a pre-tribulational rapture. Are you able to follow that? It's not too many assumptions.
Any chance you could repeat it?
Yeah. So the Old Testament promises Israel they will multiply numerically, more than they ever have. You see that in Deuteronomy 30. You see that at the end of Isaiah. There's several other places, I would argue. But that can't happen if Jesus returns and they're all resurrected. The argument is based on a linking of these two texts, 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15. And you will often hear them quoted together. We'll be raised up to meet him in the air, and we shall all be changed in the twinkling of an eye. Those are two different books, two different passages, but they're almost always quoted together. And if you assume they're talking about the same event, then you have to say when Jesus returns, all those who follow him will be given resurrection bodies. And the argument is, well, if this all happens at the same time, God can't fulfill his promises, because they need time not being resurrected to multiply and fulfill the promises God gave them. He gave them specific promises in Isaiah about their children, that their children would no longer be wandering astray like all the children of past generations had. You know, the children will obey their parents and live long in the land. Well, how long? A lot longer than they had before. As old as the trees, Isaiah says. So if you're able to follow that, I think those two together are the strongest cases for believing in a rapture. But I'll tell you why I think both of those arguments actually fall apart when you look closer. The first one, that he comes at a time you don't expect, therefore it must be any moment. I would love to believe Jesus could come at any moment, because I'd like him to come right now. The problem I have is the apostles didn't believe he could come at any moment. Because the apostles weren't just told that the Antichrist would come first, they were also told how Peter would die, for example. Peter was told how he would die at the end of John, right? You all remember that? This was said to him to tell him in which way he would die, and they clarify that John wasn't told he would remain to the end. It just looked like he'd been told that. What Jesus said was, "What's it to you if John stays until I return?" But they knew how Peter would die. And so as long as Peter was around, and Peter was around while most of the New Testament was written, including all these passages that Peter himself wrote at times about the Lord coming like a thief in the night at an hour you don't expect, they couldn't have believed it meant any moment. Because they knew how Peter was going to die, and it wasn't going to be by being changed in the twinkling of an eye. So I don't think that works. Whatever you do with the concept of his imminent return, saying it could be any moment just doesn't seem necessary or even wise in light of that. The second one I do believe that God has made promises to Israel and that they will multiply. I read the Old Testament straightforwardly. I think that's what the Jews believe. That's what they've believed since it was written. That's what they still believe, because that's what it says. But to say that Jesus has to come secretly first and save the church separately, it makes an unhelpful distinction between the church and Israel in some ways. It makes it out, and this goes back to older dispensationalism. In older dispensationalism, they very firmly believed that God had two separate plans of salvation. In some extremes, even two separate peoples, an earthly people, the Jews, and a heavenly people, the church. And their eschatology reflected that. I find that very difficult to square with Paul's teaching, that we are partakers of the same promise, members of the same household. What they did with that, essentially, is they said, well, once you become a church, you leave Israel. And so in the church, you're partakers of one promise. I just find that a very difficult reading. That said, God has made promises to the nation. So how does that work out? To argue that it works out based on a rapture that comes any moment, it assumes that 1 Thessalonians 4 is discussing the same moment that 1 Corinthians 15 is discussing. So let's turn there as well. Now, like I said, I'll tell you what I think, and you can disagree. This is how I read it. I don't know of anyone else who reads it this way, but that's what happens when you get into eschatology. Everybody's got their own view. What I do want to assure you of is that the passages aren't in contradiction. You can read the Bible, and I hope you'll copy me in this, that you look for it to harmonize. You hope it all makes sense together. 1 Corinthians 15. It's a big chapter. Somebody finds the verse before me. I'm looking for the last trumpet. And this isn't my Bible, so I'm a little slower. There it is, at the very end. Verse 51. 1 Corinthians 15:51. Paul says, "Listen, I will tell you a mystery. We will not all die, but we will all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For this perishable body shall put on imperishability, and this mortal body shall put on immortality. When this perishable body puts on imperishability, and this mortal body puts on immortality, then the saying that is written will be fulfilled. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?" The question is, when is the last trumpet? Does anyone know of any other verses that mention the last trumpet? I like the blank faces, because this is the only verse that mentions it.
I thought the answer was in Revelation, probably.
Well, you could assume that, and there are trumpets in Revelation. But Revelation wasn't written when Paul wrote this, and I'm certain, therefore, that Paul wasn't thinking of that. He's using the last trumpet to describe something he intends to be understood before Revelation was written. And in the ancient world, you'd blow a trumpet to declare the start of a battle or the end of a battle. Trumpets were blown in battle. To me, it seems that the best way to read this is that when the last trumpet is blown is when the last enemy is defeated, which is death, which is exactly where he goes. And so if you believe that there's going to be a millennium where there are people who are resurrected and people who aren't, and that seems to be what Revelation 20 says, because there's people who come to life and reign with Christ for 1,000 years, and then you have a second resurrection. So if there's a time when people are resurrected and other people are still dying, and there seems to be people still dying because there's a battle after the millennium, Satan is released, he leads people to war, and Jesus defeats them all. death hasn't been defeated till after the millennium. And so as I read 1 Corinthians, I think he's talking about after the millennium. I read 1 Thessalonians 4. He's describing that people will be gathered up to meet the Lord in the air when he returns. I don't see any reason to think that being caught up in the air means you'll be resurrected. The dead will be resurrected. He says they'll be resurrected first. The rest will be caught up in the air. To me, that makes the most sense of when he says the dead will rise first, because it's first by 1,000 years. So that's how I read it. Take it or leave it. But I bring it up today because if I'm right, then when tribulation comes, we'll have to go through it. And the book of Revelation is written to encourage us to have faith to endure through it. Now, even if I'm wrong, there's been lots of tribulations that have come and gone. And the church has endured through them. I think the final one will be like those. But even if I'm wrong, there's a very good chance there will be tribulation in our day. And maybe it won't be the last one. I hope it is. Jesus said that the tribulation of those days will be worse than any that have come before and ever will be after. I find that scary. Not that I'm afraid, but you read that differently after World War I and World War II. Because there was so much suffering in the last century that to say that the tribulation coming is worse means more now that so much evil has happened. Now, if there's a nuclear war and Jesus doesn't come back, I'll be terrified to think what the actual tribulation will be like. But, that said, in any case, the book is written to give somebody encouragement to endure. Any questions at this point?
I've always thought that we read this as North American Christians, and there's got to be people in other places of the world that don't have this struggle about pre-trib and post-trib because of the life they've lived.
Mm-hmm.
The people that can't imagine having it any worse, right? They must feel like they're in the middle of tribulation.
Yep.
Where does Putin come into the picture?
I have no idea. No idea at all. I've got a nosebleed, though. That's annoying. Anybody got a tissue? There's one in the back. Hopefully you can take me seriously. My sister want to know.
Do you think that, one more question, do you think Noah and the ark is a picture in any way of...
Well, Jesus says it is, right?
Right, but, yes, definitely. But I'm always trying to figure out which way it is, right?
Yeah. Well, the picture Jesus gives is one will be taken and one will be left. And God brings destruction on the whole world. I don't think the flood is a picture of the Antichrist attacking people. I think it's a picture of the wrath of God on mankind. And Peter says that once God destroyed the world with water, next time he'll use fire. I think Peter's picking up on the same thing Jesus was saying. The righteous will be saved. I'm going to stay on that question for a little bit. We have an idea that there are days of judgment and days of salvation. We look forward to days of salvation. Maybe we are not so excited about days of judgment. Does that sound accurate? Which would you prefer, a day of salvation or a day of judgment? In the Bible, they're usually the same day. God brings salvation to Israel by destroying and judging Egypt. God brings salvation to Jerusalem by destroying the Assyrian army outside its gates. Let's go to 2 Thessalonians. We'll just read the first little bit of chapter 1, starting in verse 6. It is indeed just of God to repay with affliction those who afflict you, and to give relief to the afflicted as well as to us. You see how those are the same thing? How is he going to bring relief to his people? By afflicting their afflictors. When the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven, with his mighty angels in flaming fire, inflicting vengeance on those who do not know God and those who do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, they will suffer the punishment of eternal destruction, separated from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his might, when he comes to be glorified by his saints, and to be marveled at on that day among all who believed. So there's a day that is God's judgment on the world, and that same day is the day he brings salvation to his people. That's what we read in chapter 6 of Revelation, where the saints under the altar are crying out, "How long?" They're asking for a day of judgment. How long until you avenge us? And God says, well, there's a lot more of you who have to die first, and I'll avenge them too.
That's why it's the great and terrible day of the Lord.
Mm-hmm. Well, great and terrible is probably just a way of saying really terrible.
I've always thought that it was great for those for whom it's great.
The problem would be great in English has the connotation of good. And in Greek and Hebrew, it usually just means big.
Yeah.
So when you say something's great and mighty, it's big and mighty.
Okay. That's true in British English. It's just really
Yeah.
North America that we...
I think it's kind of recent slang to use great that way.
Yeah.
It's something we always have to be careful of is reading modern slang, and sometimes it's tricky if you only know the one language to know. Sometimes a verse can be read a few different ways, like the rent garment in the King James. In King James English, rent means destroyed.
Torn.
Yeah, but we use rent differently now, and so if you're reading King James, you're going to run into all kinds of problems because our language has changed. Okay. Are we good to move on to 13 and 14? Sort of. If you had questions about the rapture, I covered it pretty briefly. Essentially, those who believe that God has some future for Israel are more prone to believe that there's a pre-tribulational rapture. It's tied up with that system. And I have a lot of agreement with them. I think they pick up on some things that were almost forgotten in church history. But sometimes this is how it is when you discover something new. You go too far with it. And they make it so that the church and Israel are so different that God has, one of them's going to suffer and one of them's not. You do have a bit of that in Revelation. But part of the problem is, with that system, in Revelation, it's the church that suffers and the Jews who don't. Which is difficult if you think he's taking away the church so that the Jews can suffer. All right. Again, that's a simplistic overview, but Revelation 13 and 14. I want to point out, sorry, this is driving me crazy, there's blood on the floor. I'll clean it up better later. In chapter 13, the call for endurance is given in the context of the Antichrist's kingdom. In chapter 14, the call to endurance is given in the context of God's wrath and God's salvation. Both of these realities should encourage us to endure, or at least should motivate us to endure. I said this last week, but you could pick. You can either suffer God's wrath or you can suffer the beast's wrath. And you can also have one of their favor. Chapter 13, the beast is described, both beasts here are described in language that comes straight out of Daniel. The 10 horns are from Daniel. The 42 months from Daniel. Uttering blasphemies against God, that's from Daniel. Authority over all the nations, that's from Daniel. The idea of worshipping an image, I think that's from Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar sets up his idol and makes them all worship it. Well, so does this beast, but this idol comes to life, and they all worship it. A lot of this comes from Daniel. Which I bring up just so I can say, In Daniel, this figure is described as someone who gives favor to those who serve him. Jesus describes this time, and he says, "The love of many will grow cold because lawlessness increases." I'm trying to describe the same thing with those two verses. Lawlessness increases. Law is meant to restrain evil, usually by adding consequence. People do more evil when there's less consequences. If you go to California right now, it's not illegal to steal under $1,000 worth of stuff from wherever you want. And what do you know? More people are stealing. I can't imagine why. Yes, I can. It's because lawlessness is increasing there. When you can get away with something, you're a lot more likely to do it. When you're rewarded for doing evil, you're even more likely to do it. And this will be what the Antichrist's kingdom is like. He will give favor to those who worship him, who follow him, and he'll persecute those who don't. So not only will you be able to get away with evil very easily, you'll be rewarded for doing evil. And the question is, are you going to be able to follow God when it seems like nobody's watching? When it seems like the wicked prosper, they become rich, they get to do whatever they want, they get to rule. And Daniel describes that this figure will dole out ruling positions for those who follow him, much like Jesus will in the end. You know, Jesus promises that we'll get to rule with him, and he'll give us authority over the earth in chapter 2, maybe it's chapter 3, to rule it with a rod of iron. Will you be able to follow Jesus when somebody else is actually doing that right in front of you for other people who get to do whatever they want? I mean, we all hate sin. But the forbidden fruit was actually delicious. Otherwise, Eve wouldn't have given it to Adam after she tasted it, right? It was desirable to the eyes. So in this time, the beast and his kingdom will make it very easy for people to sin. I find it telling that in chapter 14, the 144,000 are described as those who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. These follow the Lamb wherever he goes. Not 100% sure what to do with that verse, but I can say with some confidence that there will be a lot of sin in the Antichrist's kingdom. And Jesus said the love of many will grow cold. I don't think he means just the world. They didn't have love to begin with. There will be people who call themselves Christian, and their love will grow cold. Instead of serving God fervently, it'll seem like Jesus delays. You know, maybe he's not coming. And it'd be a whole lot nicer to just do whatever I want and be rich than to do what he says and be tortured. Chapter 13 gives you the reason you need the call. We need to be told to endure because we've been told persecution is coming. God has warned us beforehand. He says this all over the Old Testament. In fact, we're going to talk about that in the sermon today because he does it in Habakkuk too. He tells them that trouble is coming before it happens and says, this is what I want you to do in the middle of it. Before Jerusalem was destroyed, he tells them about it many times. Both times it was destroyed. Before they go out into exile, when did God first tell them they were going to go into exile? Does anybody know? Who first told them? Moses. And he told them pretty straightforwardly. It wasn't an if, it was a when. And when all these things happen to you, the blessing and the curse, I will restore you and take you from all the furthest reaches of the earth, where I have scattered you. They knew the exile was coming a long time, and God had told them, even hundreds of years before it happened, the faith that he wanted them to have when it happened, so that they would know he was God. And he's done the same for us. He's told us persecution is coming, And even he told us, this is almost 2,000 years ago, this was written down. He told us beforehand so that we would know he's not surprised by it. His promise is the same. And he wants us to endure when the love of many grows cold. When it would be... I think the best picture of this in my life is the internet. In the internet, lawlessness increases. You could do whatever you want. Who's going to catch you? Who's even going to know? You can go and... I've heard that people go and they find some random Facebook group where everyone's happy and they start trolling them until everybody's mad because you just love to watch people suffer. And you could get away with it because you made up a username and nobody knows it's you. Are we able to honor God in secret because we trust that he sees in secret and he rewards those who will love him in secret? If you do that now, I think you're situated well for the end times. If you don't do it now, I hope you'll join me in asking God to teach us to obey this, that we would endure. Chapter 14, this same command is given in the context. Look at 14 verse 8. Another angel, a second, followed, saying, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication." Then another angel, a third, followed him, crying with a loud voice, "Those who worship the beast and its image and receive a mark on their foreheads or on their hands, they will also drink the wine of God's wrath, poured unmixed into the cup of his anger. They will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels, in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. There is no rest, day or night, for those who worship the beast and its image, for anyone who receives the mark of his name." Here is a call for the endurance of the saints.
Can I ask you a question, Elijah?
Yeah.
As a pastor, you're going to go lead a church. What do you plan to do in striking maybe this is the wrong wording, you can change it, the balance as a leader between adequately preparing your congregation for this reality, which you clearly see, and I recognize it as well, but I feel like I'm always in danger of, tipping into the prophet of doom. Always thinking about, I got to prepare these people. They've grown up in this North American bubble, and this is coming. And I feel like what I see in the media and on the internet, and the example that you use there, that this is becoming more and more imminent to me. From my perspective, it could be, like you said, it could be after a nuclear war.
Jerusalem could be destroyed 3 more times.
Right. So how do you strike that balance between preparing people to live and enjoy their work and their family and not lose sight of this?
I would disagree with the premise, actually.
Okay.
You mentioned a North American bubble.
Yeah.
And I think that misunderstands how North America fits into what's going on here. I don't mean prophetically like North America's prophesied, but I mean the things that we go through in North America, where we're rich, is not a contrast to the sufferings that the saints go through and the trials that they endure, but is actually one of the trials they endure. And that's why I tried to make a big deal of the letters at the beginning of the book. Because the letters picture churches going through different situations. The church in Philadelphia is told, "I will keep you from the hour of trial that's coming." They're the only ones told that. I don't think that in the end times the church will go through the same thing universally. We'll suffer in all kinds of different ways. Some of us have to be able to serve God in the midst of wealth. Some of us, when the end times come, will you care more about the persecution of other Christians than you do now? Because there's lots of Christians being persecuted right now. And I think it's easy to imagine, we'll be like all the many people who housed the Jews during the Holocaust. we'll be there for them. But are we there for them? Do we even care? This last year, so much happened in Afghanistan. Have we gone out of our way to do anything? I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to rebuke us. I just mean, there might be churches, even in the end times, who go through struggles like ours. And we're called to be faithful in the time that we're given. And it's not a different kind of faithfulness that can put up with the internet than that can put up with the Antichrist. Because if you can't be faithful with the money God's given you, and He's given us all lots of money, if you can't be faithful with the time He's given you, and we have more free time than almost anyone else in the world, then we're not going to be faithful in the end. So the way that we have to live in North America is the way that we have to live to get through the end times. The problem isn't that we're in North America. The problem is we're not faithful. And so I would want to use Revelation even to address our prosperity and ask if we're living in our prosperity in a way that suits the saints who are persecuted, or in a way that sounds like Babylon, who's denounced, where they profit off others' sufferings. It's unfortunate. Liberal Christianity at times has so focused on doing good for the poor that they lose sight of the gospel and turn it into the gospel. But even more unfortunate, perhaps, is sometimes as conservatives, we say, that's awful, so we're not going to do anything for the poor. An overreaction. Does that sort of answer your question? I think that the end times are not, in their nature, different than right now. There's a sense we are in the end times, and God is calling us to faith right now. You have to endure every day. You could go right now and you could commit murder on the internet. You could find, you could probably, if you wanted, hire an assassin and cover up your tracks. You could easily commit adultery on the internet. There's a lot of evil you could do on the internet, and nobody around you would know. You could get away with it. Now, I don't think any of you are committing murder. But how do you live in secret? Because that's probably how you'll live in the end times. I think that addresses your question. All right, final point, and I'll stop early because I'm doing the sermon and you'll see enough of me. Chapter 14 puts the call to endurance in the context of God's wrath on those who worship the beast. In the end times, you'll be tempted to sin in all kinds of ways, and those who sin will prosper, and those who do good will suffer. God is calling us to have faith in what we can't see. You have to believe the exact opposite of what you see, that those who sin will suffer, and those who obey will prosper in the end. Even though God seems very slow in doing it, and you'll wonder, if God's really going to do it, why hasn't He done it yet? How many people have to die before He does it? Does He not care? He says He cares. And that's the same faith we're called to have now. It seems even today that the wicked prosper. You can get a lot of money by being wicked. There's lots of people who do. You can just look at any politician and you'll see they can get away with anything. They could probably confess to the murders they call suicide. They'd still get away with it. We have to believe, in spite of what we see, that God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. And so we should endure in light of that. I'm going to pray for us that we would. Lord God, I thank You for Your word, that You have not left us in the dark, but You have made known to us that there is an hour of trial coming upon the whole earth. Lord, I thank You that though in this world we will have trouble, yet You have overcome the world. I ask that You would remind us of Your goodness on the cross, that the righteous sufferer ultimately is Jesus. Help us to imitate Him. Help us to be willing to partake in his sufferings so that we might also partake in his glory. Lord, we believe, help our unbelief. Help us to keep from sin at the present hour, to be faithful because we don't know when you're coming. Help us not to act as though you're not, or as though we'll have time to be better Christians later. Help us to follow you now. In Jesus' name.